Welcome, everyone, to this IMS Leadership Conversations podcast. My name is Charles Good, your host and the president of the Institute for Management Studies. This podcast is designed to provide you with actionable insights and strategies that you can apply from discussing the research with esteemed leadership experts and practitioners to hopefully take your leadership to the next level. My goal is that what we have discussed will be immediately actionable and useful to you. And I'd love to hear your comments for this episode in the chat or in the episode comments area of what you're planning to implement. Today, I'm glad to be joined by Lida Citroen. She's an award-winning personal branding and reputation management expert and author of several best-selling books, including her latest, Control the Narrative, The Executive's Guide to Building, Pivoting, and Repairing Your Reputation. And another book that I love by her is Reputation 360, Creating Power Through Personal Branding. That's going to be the topic for today's program. Welcome to the program, Lida.
Thanks so much, Charles. Great to be with you.
Great. I love to start each episode just kind of giving some background, and just you have a strong background in the military. So I'd love to see how that was part of you building your brand about this critical leadership topic in today's culture, and how you pivoted or how you've expanded your brand from the military to the corporate environment, where you've talked to a lot of large companies now about how to build their brand, repair it, and pivot into a new area.
Well, and I appreciate the question because it allows me to talk about my passion, which is working with veterans. As you know, I'm a civilian. I've never served in uniform, nor did I know anyone who had been in the military prior to learning kind of by happenstance that the work that I do with IMS and other organizations to share the power of personal branding was not being talked about in military circles. So people were exiting the armed forces, whether it's after 4 years or 44 years, and trying to enter the private sector without understanding who they are, what's their value proposition, and how they want to position themselves. So I literally 12 years ago found an opportunity to just kind of lean in and say, I could help here. And it's been a wonderful ride ever since. It certainly complemented my brand and my legacy.
Well, that's great. Well, let's start with, how do you effectively build your brand? And you identify 3 distinct parts. It's really about what you tell yourself, what you tell other people, and then what other people share about you. But let's first talk about that first step, is what you tell yourself, or that self-talk. Why is that so important when you're trying to build your brand?
Well, where you're getting at is narrative, right? And narrative is the story of you, the story of what you've done before. It's our history. And it's interesting to think about, but can we rewrite our history? Well, we kind of can. We can in how we shape our experience, how we shape the story of how we got to this point. We can rewrite the story of who we are. And that's why I love narrative as one of the ways that we build brand. But when I talk about self-talk, the messages we give ourselves, if we're not clear about who we are, why we're here, who we want to serve, and how we want to be known, then it's no wonder people default to almost a generic or brandless persona, right? They're trying to be liked by everyone, respected by everyone, and relevant to anyone who will look their direction. And as we know in product brands or companies, being specific, being branded, and being clear makes you more desirable. So when I say it starts with what you tell yourself, if you're not clear, then no wonder other people don't know, like, should I invite Charles to that meeting? Does he want a promotion? Like, they don't understand you. And so they go to the person who makes it easier. And what you tell yourself actually leaks out into what you tell other people, because none of us are good at acting. So much as we might think we are, what we're feeling and what we believe to be true about ourselves comes through in how we talk about ourselves to other people. So if I want you to take me seriously, if I want you to see me as compassionate and credible, but I don't believe it myself because my self-talk is negative, then that's going to leak out into how I talk about myself. And you're going to walk away going, yeah, I don't buy it. I could tell she doesn't buy it, but I'm certainly not going to. And then the real risk is that person you might turn around and tell someone else, you don't want to work with her. She tries to sell a good story, but it's not there. That's why I say the power of narrative really starts with what you tell yourself. If I'm coming out with clear, confident, and compelling messages, that get you, interested, and now you're paying attention, and you go and tell someone else that same message. Now the pass along value is much higher of my value.
No, that's great. And just to reiterate, that self-talk frames the narrative in which your reputation is going to be built around. Reputation, personal brand, it's all one and the same thing, or very interconnected here. So it's so important to really frame that narrative in the right way. And you, like you said, you have to believe that this is your authentic self. So I know that you believe this, that you really need to be authentic to manage your reputation and design your legacy. You can't pretend to be someone you're not, because it's going to come across as not genuine or fake.
Yeah. And, I was saying to somebody earlier today, I kind of feel like authenticity and authentic has become the innovation of 5 years ago, right? Everything
Right.
was innovative and everybody. But what does it really mean to be authentic? If you think about, and I define it a little bit differently than some people. If you think about what authenticity really means, it means that when you ask me a question, I will give you a truthful, genuine answer. I'm not going to try and be different people to different people, but it doesn't mean transparency. I don't believe authenticity, to be seen as authentic, means you have to tell people everything. And I think that's where a lot of people get stuck in building out their reputation through personal branding tools. Is they feel like if I'm going to show up online, or I'm going to talk about my dreams and my hopes with my boss, that means I have to tell them everything, what I'm afraid of and where I've had trauma or tragedy. And that's just not the case. As human beings, as adults, we're allowed to keep boundaries around certain things in our lives that are private. But if you ask me a question and I'm going to give you an answer, it's got to be the truth. I have the right to say, I'm not comfortable answering that, or not being tagged in a photo. That's something I don't want to talk about online. But what I say should be the truth. It just has to be the truth.
There you go. And I know that you see authenticity as that which is real and true to who you are. You need to act consistent to your values. You build integrity, and that reflects back to that authenticity that you're building. And strong personal brands, right, have reputations that are consistent with an individual's values, beliefs, and desires. So as you're building your brand, your reputation is a part of that, and it needs to be consistent in those ways. So it's really takes leaders should take time to really understanding, what do they value most? What are their beliefs? And build their brand around those that are important to them, that speak to them in a very authentic way. Correct?
Absolutely. And you're right. Something you said earlier is absolutely right. And I'm guilty of this too. I use the terms interchangeably: personal brand, reputation. One way that I sometimes explain it is your personal brand is what you do and what you focus on. Your reputation is what you earn. Because if you think about it, all of us have a brand. We all have a reputation. It might not be strategic and it might not be what we want. But if I were to go out and ask 5 people to describe Charles, they're going to give me answers. It's whether those answers are consistent, and are their responses what you really want them to see as your value. And that's where our perception versus other people's perception sometimes gets a little muddy. My clients typically will tell me, oh, I have a really good sense of how I'm known. That's one of my first questions when I work with a client. And they'll rattle off all sorts of descriptors about how their teams or their board or their colleagues, their manager sees them. But then we go out and we ask those people to describe them. And sometimes we get very different responses, or they're saying it in a different way. And it isn't a right or wrong. It's just understanding that sometimes the way we think we're coming across, or the way that we're perceived by the people we work with or we want to lead, can be really different. And that kind of gets to the question of perspective, right? My perspective is very different than someone who interacts with me once a week or once a month. Their perspective and vantage point is going to be really different than what I see and what I believe to be true. But what matters is that for both of us, what we perceive is what we think is real. And perception is a tricky one. I get a lot of pushback when I talk about perception, because people say, we're not supposed to judge, and it's not fair that people have biases. And I agree. I don't think it's fair. And it's kind of sad, but it's also human. Human beings judge, and we form perception as a way of shortcutting all of this information that comes in. So Would it be amazing if everybody was a blank slate? Possibly. But if we know that people are going to perceive us, and perhaps that perception is wrong, it's based on wrong information or inadequate information, then where does the control lie? The control lies with me to be able to do everything that I can to positively impact that perception.
Well, and that's so important. I'd love to just go over that just and
Sure.
reinforce this to the listeners of this podcast, because what you're trying to build with your personal brand, it can't make you something you're not. It has to be authentic with your individual values, beliefs, and strategies. But I love the distinction you draw with your reputation. That's based on other people's perceptions of how they think you are. So it's really not all dependent on you. You can try to influence it, you can try to impact it, but a lot of that is based off of how they're perceiving you come across in the role that you occupy in that particular situation. So, and that's so important because a lot of leaders say it, I'm guilty of it. You don't know your blind spots, and you have to be more self-aware, and you have to ask for that. And even if it's tough feedback, being aware, making those adjustments is critical, because so many people, either they don't acknowledge it, they ignore it, they choose to deny it, or their defense mechanisms go up to say, well, that's not the what I wanted. One leader says, everyone sees your behavior, whereas you view it as your intent. My intent here is not to be perceived that way, but that's the way it was perceived. So you got to acknowledge that, right? And be more aware of your blind spots and try to look for those, or ask people for help if you can, to acknowledge, okay, where do you see, here's what I'm trying to go for. Here's my intent, right? But give me your perception on how is that coming across?
And that is probably one of the hardest parts of building a brand, is being able to be vulnerable and open yourself up to that feedback. My clients are usually a little skeptical. They think they know, they feel overly confident. But then when it comes to asking people, if it's not framed up right, they might think that I'm inviting criticism or I'm making myself look weak. But to your point, if asking for feedback is a gift, then I'm giving myself a gift, because I can't know my blind spots. That's why, hence they're called blind spots. And I'll give you an example. So when I left corporate after 20 years, I started my own company, and I knew I was putting my name was going to be in the name of the company. And I didn't know what I didn't know. I knew I'd had a lot of success. I thought I had a great reputation. I had a lot of accomplishments and the awards and all of that stuff, but I didn't know what I didn't know. And so I asked a bunch of people to sort of point out my strengths and weaknesses. I didn't have the branding piece all figured out then. And I got feedback that certainly pointed to the accomplishments and the recognition and all the things that I knew. But there were some messages that said I had hurt some feelings along the way. And in my quest to achieve and succeed and drive results, I left some damaged relationships that I had no idea about. And was it hard to hear? Of course, it was hard to hear. I thought I treated everybody pretty well. But what it gave me, and this is why I say it's a gift, what it gave me is an opportunity to look at my actions and look at how I'd communicated, ask myself, is that how I want to be remembered by people who matter to me? No. So what do I need to do to course correct that? Had I not had that insight, I would have started my company and built out my brand in a more public way, not realizing some of my actions had created those feelings. So
That's right.
it's not always easy to hear, but it is a tool that we use. Feedback is always a tool we use to
Right.
measure, do we need to make changes? Because let's face it, I got a lot of feedback on my driving. Doesn't mean I'm making all the changes. But when it comes to my reputation and things I care about that I want to be known by, yeah, those are things that I'm going to look at making changes.
No, that's great. And just understanding the fact that with leaders coming up is to be vulnerable, right? To open those vulnerability loops so that you can get that honest feedback. What I find though, for the more senior level leaders, is that they don't get honest feedback. People don't want to state their true feelings about them, possibly, or give them the honest feedback they need. So in those times, they have to hire an external coach or someone else to really help get them to that level, because they are now they're willing to be vulnerable, but they're not getting the feedback they need because people are reserved in what they say based on their position.
Well, and you're absolutely right. So whenever I do feedback and I do perception mapping, so not a 360, the feedback always comes to me. It's always confidential unless somebody decides to copy the client
Right.
on it. I only had one client try to circumvent the process by having the feedback sent to him before it came to me. And it was like, okay, that totally skewed the results. Because you're right. People thought, well, my boss is going to see this. So I better say something good because my name's attached to it. And that's not helpful. We want to get that feedback that shows us what we're not seeing that other people are seeing. Again, they might be seeing something that's inaccurate or incomplete, but that's still important for us to know.
No, that's great. And we've kind of driven this point home. I think you got to be vulnerable to get the feedback. You got to want it. You got to identify ways in which you can get honest feedback, and then you got to do something with it, right? It's not just enough to know about it. What are you going to do differently next time so that these same mistakes don't keep happening? Because to create a lasting impact and connect with people, you need to seek influence and you need to make these changes. So you need to ask questions like, am I letting people truly see who I am and what I care about? How do I handle difficult situations? Do I pretend to be someone I'm not? I think that imposter syndrome happens a lot, especially for new and emerging leaders where they really don't have an identity yet. And they're trying to pretend to be something that they're not. And it doesn't come across that well.
Yeah, I mean, that's why I go back to saying most of us aren't good enough at acting. We're just not. It's not sustainable. And if you don't have a sense of who you are and you don't know what it means to be authentic, it makes perfect sense that you would be trying to fill a role that you think is expected. And maybe it just comes with maturity. I don't know, but I think as you get older, you kind of realize that that was a lot of work that didn't get you anywhere. So, yeah, I totally agree.
And how can you take pride out of the equation? So, how can you address your faults with a little more humility? That's really difficult for a lot of leaders is to take that ego out of it and just address these issues and not have it reflect back on them to say, okay, I'm assassinating my character now because now I must not be an effective leader. That's not the case. It's just in this situation, you didn't act the way you should have acted. You didn't act effectively. So we need to correct the behavior without assassinating the entire person.
And one of the ways that I solve for that is I make sure my client or the recipient knows this is in your best interest. This isn't because we're going to change who you are to make all these other people happy. That's not what this is about. But if you want to succeed and we see the prize, and this is a roadblock to getting that prize, then we're going to make some choices. And that's why I say not all feedback has to get acted on. If I got feedback where somebody said, you're too type A, you're too outgoing, yeah, I'm okay with that. I'm not going to change that. And we don't change who we are, but we might modify our behavior. I might show up a little more reserved or cautious if my client is overwhelmed by my outgoing personality. That's not changing who I am. And that's not being disingenuous. I'm just modifying my behavior because it's in my best interest for my client to relate to me. So I think if we think about it selfishly, then it makes it more tolerable to get feedback that will help us get better.
And I think that's an important distinction that you want to remain authentic. So you aren't going to try to change who you are, or if you're not a humorous person to become more jolly and fun loving,
Right.
but you're going to modify certain behaviors in certain situations to be more effective because it does serve your best interest.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So now we've unpacked the branding and the reputation and given our listeners a few steps on really how to build that. Want to move into another critical area that if you're moving, which right now we're in the great resignation, a lot of people are changing jobs, industries, occupations. As you move from one career or job to another, what are the steps that you should focus on so that it's successful and you build that brand in that new industry?
Well, there's certainly a lot of shifts going on. And sometimes people are making dramatic shifts, right? They're going from full time into gig type work and stringing together a bunch of gig jobs, changing industries. We're also seeing people climb up the ladder, if you will. So they're jumping a couple of rungs from manager into the C suite. There are some mistakes happening, definitely mistakes happening. A few that I would point out. I think people are sharing information online that they're going to regret. If you're leaving your past employer because it just didn't work out or the career growth wasn't there for you, be careful torching the place as you go out the door online. And we're seeing some of that where people are just saying negative things about their past employer on social media. That follows you. And, your next employer is watching that, wondering, what are you going to say when you leave them? Same thing with relationships. Some of the relationships that got you to that great opportunity need to continue to be nurtured. There's no guarantee that what comes next is going to last or be there long term. And we don't want to burn bridges. That's a really tricky thing to recover from. And then I think also being mindful of a strategy. We saw a lot of people in 2021, and we're seeing it in this year. We're changing, for work-life balance and for income, right? A big bump in salary compensation. Work-life balance, I'm all on board for. If that's what keeps you happy as a person, we got to pay attention to that. But just moving for money or just moving for perks and incentives, I could sometimes be short-sighted. And I've already seen some people start to backpedal a little bit and think, maybe I was premature. I jumped too soon and I wasn't really thinking about where I was going. I didn't have a strategy. And, many of us do that. I did that for a lot of my career. I just moved to the next job because it was more money and more fun, more visibility. But I think if you have a strategy, then you see how each piece lays on top of itself. And then you can build reputation assets that go with that. You understand how to be online. You understand the kind of network that you need to have around you, who's going to help you today and be with you in 5-10 years to get you to that leadership level. You've got the systems in place for the duration. The short-term fix is usually not ideal for most people.
When you provide some effective steps, if people are considering doing this, you state first, consider your goals. What is the career goal in making this pivot, right? So you want a more deliberate strategy. List your current assets. How are you known today? Decide which assets are most valuable to take with you into your next career, because there's always something that will carry over. That career equity that you built in this career likely is going to overlap to some extent in the next career that you want. And then I think most importantly, which many people maybe don't do this deliberately enough initially, is identify the gaps between where you are versus where you want to be. Is it a chasm? Is it a small little hole that you can easily jump over and assume those? And many people don't look at that initially. They just figure, I'll figure it out when I get there, right?
Right.
And that's usually not the best approach.
It's a challenging approach. Just hope you have a strong stomach for it, because that's a tough one. And I think that's where, one of the things I introduced in Control the Narrative was the idea of an agreement. And the agreement is a really important part of brand building and career strategy, because your agreement is with yourself. And the agreement says that, the bright and shiny objects that are going to pass in front of me all the time, that are going to try and, lure me away from my path or my strategy, your agreement is what keeps you grounded. And it's a tremendous commitment you make to yourself. When you have a strategy, there are highs and lows in executing that strategy, any type of strategy. What's going to keep you grounded into what you know best? And the frenzy around this great resignation that's happening, I think, has caused some people to lose sight of things like that. So that would be an important step to include as well. Make sure you're grounded in what you know you want and how you need to get there.
And I'll reiterate that transitioning your reputation's assets from one path to another takes finesse, takes skill, takes planning. So do it more deliberately, like what you're stating, Lida. Don't just do it haphazardly and trusting that everything's going to work out once you make that change.
Right. Absolutely.
Now let's look at another area around reputation and branding, and that's if someone's attacking your reputation. So unlike more passive forms of reputation damage where you're being typecast in your career because you've always been in that career, that's where all your career equity lies, or you're failing to advocate for yourself. This is when someone's deliberately trying to discredit you, trying to harm you, or negatively impact you. Now, what kind of tactics can someone use if they're in that situation?
And I'm glad I was able to write about that, because you'd be amazed how many people experience reputation crisis. And it isn't just typecasting that can be on the sort of passive side. Workplace bullying is is a huge phenomenon. And once I started sort of putting a light on workplace mobbing or workplace bullying, a lot of people said, I didn't realize that's what was happening to me, but that's exactly what was happening to me. People picking on them, sending them the wrong time for meetings and setting them up to be humiliated and publicly shamed. And then what you're getting at is, people who either make a mistake or become the target. And let's face it, a lot of people make mistakes. Whether you post something online that you thought was funny or you share something you thought was clever and it ends up backfiring, you engage in a debate that you have no business participating in, and all of a sudden now all the eyes are looking at you, or you've done something more significant in your business, in your personal life, and you are the subject of negative Google searches. It's a horrible place to be, whether it was your fault or not. And I've had a lot of clients who it wasn't their fault, but they end up in the crosshairs. First thing, and this is the hardest, is to separate out emotion. When people usually call me or they email me, they're in a highly emotional state. They're upset, they feel targeted. Their knee-jerk reaction has been to take down all of their social media because that feels like hiding, which is the worst thing you could do. But their emotions are raw. So one of the first things I try to do is look at what happened versus how we feel about what happened. Because to the subject of this, it's all mixed up. And sometimes just separating it helps us understand what are the short-term and the long-term implications. Is this your feelings got hurt because somebody didn't like your restaurant? Or, is your career torpedoed? Like, what are we really looking at? So separating emotion from fact as best you can. And if you can't do it yourself, get a trusted ally or a coach or somebody to help you manage that piece. Surround yourself with a small but very loyal set of people. The challenges that unfold in the weeks and months after a reputation crisis are going to require sort of a board of advisors that you can go to. And that's really helpful to gut check and make sure that you're seeing things clearly and that you make decisions in the best way possible. When you're in a state of trauma, you usually don't make good decisions. So get people around you that you trust who aren't just going to say what you want to hear, but are really going to give you good advice. Decide if you need to apologize. And I say that very specifically. Apologies are always a good thing, but sometimes apologizing from a legal standpoint has implications. So if you said something negative to somebody online and you go online and apologize, there's an admission of guilt. I'm not a lawyer, but I work with enough. Is the apology public? Is it private? What are you owning? You should know by this point what you take accountability for and what you don't. And what does that look like? If this is something that happened at work, maybe you shared confidential information by accident. You hit the wrong button, or you made a comment about the CEO online and you didn't think anybody was watching. There are levers available that we need to be careful about in our jobs. And so knowing what those are and being able to use them, whether an apology is included or not, is important. And what changes need to be made. Taking down all your social media doesn't mean nobody can find you. It just means that only one side of the story is now available. So what changes need to be made? If you need to show a community or a person or some entity, this has made an impact and you're going to make changes and act differently, how does that look? And I think the last thing is just to realize that we're human and human beings make mistakes. It's really what you do after the fact that sometimes makes or breaks how long that mistake stays public. We can't go in and just grub Google, right? I mean, they'll tell you that's kind of laughable, but context helps. The more I know about you, one mistake, one stupid comment, I might be willing to forgive if the rest of what I know about you tells me a very different story.
So it's having that relationship, building the character and having them know you on a more intimate level. So they know that maybe you're benevolent and you are honest and have high integrity, but you made a mistake, right? And they aren't really judging your competence. They're just letting that go by and saying, okay, that was one mistake. I know this individual, he or she's not the type of person to do that. So I'm going to give them a break this time.
Yeah. I
But
mean, we want people to do that for us. So I think there is a lot of that. We believe in second chances. If you double down on it, or if it shows up again, or there isn't action and the action isn't, that's where things get murky. Yeah.
So we can't go and change the past, but we can set in motion plans to ensure that it doesn't repeat in the future.
Yep.
When should you ask for others to advocate for you in this case? Should you, or should you try to handle it on your own?
That's one of the steps to consider, right? So as you get that trusted set of people around you, one of the things you would talk about is, do I need to apologize? Do I need to jump in? I'll give you an example. When I published my first book in the military, I was so excited to get this so much information out there. And I hated the fact that I had to charge for the book, but I was self-publishing it. It was expensive. I didn't have any way of distributing the book without somebody paying for it. And so I put a price on the book and put the book online, shared it on social media. Somebody actually came after me and said, if you're all about helping veterans, why are you charging for this book? Why aren't you giving it away? I mean, it's a legitimate question.
Right.
Unless you understand business, books don't publish themselves. And I sat back and I was really upset. Somebody was questioning my integrity, questioning my intent. And I remember I gave myself the night to think about it. I didn't want to just put a response out, but I was really upset. The next morning I got to the computer and I had thought about what I was going to say. By the time I jumped on, Charles, so many veterans had responded already saying, you're out of your mind. She donates thousands of hours. She has mentored me. She's coached me. She spoke at my military installation and didn't even charge. Like, they did all of it for me. And I just had to write, thank you. Because to the point we were talking about earlier, they knew who I was. They knew my integrity. They knew what I stood for. And they were probably smart enough to know that a book doesn't print itself. There's costs with that. So that was a great example where sometimes now, could you reach out to someone and say, hey, would you jump on here and just quiet this person down? You can be really careful with that because you could be throwing somebody else into the crosshairs.
Well, that's a great example, just reinforcing that as you're building that great personal brand, which you've done, and it's being reinforced by your reputation that other people see you as. And that's just a great example to drive that point home.
Thank
When you do have a reputation attack, and I agree with you, the hardest step, and I've had this before, separating emotion from fact. And when you're in that highly charged emotional state is how do you think rationally? Whereas how do you assess the potential risk? Because you tend to go into that doom and gloom scenario, right? When you're highly emotional, this is going to ruin everything. My whole career that I've built 20 years plus in developing, it's gone in an instant. When if you have some time to step back and you're in a less emotional state, you can assess those risks a little bit better. So you can look at potential negative scenarios and you can prepare for those. And you can identify maybe how visible the attack is. Sometimes it's not that visible and you take different corrective action based on that than if it's something that's in a highly visible medium.
Yeah. And let's face it, we also want to consider who's doing the attacking.
Right.
And not that that shouldn't matter.
If they're credible, it's coming from a credible source, right? Versus
Right.
someone.
Yeah. I mean, or some, kid sitting in his parents' basement who just has all these fake pseudonyms. That's a lot of, we call them trolls on the internet, but that's a lot of the people who try to stir things up. And you really want to engage with that. The problem is it's on your post or it's on your blog or it's on, somebody has called it out against you. So the person seeing that doesn't necessarily think to themselves, well, is that a 13-year-old boy in their parents' basement or is this a credible source? They see the launch and they want to know where it's going to land. And that for that reason, sometimes I will leave something up like that instead of just automatically deleting it. I don't want to incite people, but it kind of makes them feel more exposed if I don't respond. And if nobody else responds and everything else is positive, then they kind of they're hanging out there by themselves looking a little foolish. But yeah.
That's a good point that you made because
Yeah.
many of our members have noted that on their sites when they get negative feedback. They take one of maybe 2 or 3 approaches. One is they try to respond directly to that negative comment to try to see how they can make it right. And in some cases they can, and they can turn that customer around. Other cases they can't, end up going down a rabbit hole. Another approach that I've seen them take is where they just try to drown it out by a lot of positive comments. So now, like what you were saying, it's in a sea of positive comments. That one negative comment not going to hold as much weight as if there's 100 versus just 50 or 20 comments. If they can just get enough positive, then hopefully that'll drown it out. And then the third option is they just don't do anything, which I don't think is the right approach either. But that's good advice, and it's a good distinction that you draw as far as what needs to be done.
Absolutely. And other people watching this, people sometimes like to sit back and watch a fight if they think one's going to happen. I don't know why, but I think it kind of goes back to the car crash thing. We drive slow, right?
Exactly.
See what happened. Um, and there's an element of I want to see what they do because I may not want to do the same thing, or I'll do the same thing that if it ever happened to me. But really, especially when it's online, reviews, comments, posts, they can feel very personal, but unless the person knows you, it's not really personal. They're attacking a figure, they're attacking a company. They're not necessarily attacking you.
It's important to separate that out. You're right.
Yeah.
How does this relate then to what you stated with workplace bullying? Because that's a huge issue now. In the virtual environment, it's taking a little bit different form, but it's still equally prevalent, I would argue. What have you seen so far to support the facts that it's getting worse? And what are some things that individuals can take to stop it?
And I honestly didn't think it was a thing until the first client that called me and described what he had experienced at a very large, prominent institution. He described it and he used those words. This was probably about 5 or 6 years ago. I'd never heard of it. I thought, that's something we did in high school, maybe, but not as adults, surely. And there were protocols and processes to protect this, right? I've since found that it's actually very prominent across all industries and male, female, everything. I mean, everyone is usually has some story where they've been touched by it. One of the things that happens in any type of microaggression, bullying, or mobbing situation is maybe the first infraction isn't so bad, right? Oh, I gave you the wrong time for the meeting, or I didn't mean to call you that in front of other people. I made an assumption,
They
right?
try to dismiss it. Right.
Well, but that's kind of where gaslighting starts, right? It's
There you
these
go.
small things where the recipient goes, "Yeah, I'm not going to bring that to HR. It was just maybe they did make a mistake, and maybe or I'm not going to tell anybody about it." But then it keeps happening, and by the time it's happened for a while, now the person who's the subject of it starts internalizing it. I didn't stand up for myself. I didn't bring it up earlier. I've kind of condoned it because I've let it happen. Maybe I laughed at the joke they made at my expense because of my heritage, right? Whatever it is, it's now gotten out of hand. And the person who's the subject doesn't know what to do. So they've internalized all the pain and the accountability. And it's really sad. I have heard cases where people have brought it to HR, and in that state, it doesn't look like something that perhaps company leadership knows what to do with, or they don't have the systems for it. So then the person feels even worse. A lot of times that person will leave a job. And that's unfortunate because that could have been a really valuable potential leader to an organization who didn't really know where to fit in and how to find their own ground and feel good about themselves. And so they think leaving is the answer. Problem is sometimes that reputation follows them. And that's where the negative repercussions can continue. So there's a lot of things to unpack with a workplace bullying situation, but it's not as unusual as we would think. And no matter what age you are, it can happen.
And before you go into maybe some of those tactics, just to remind everyone, gaslighting is that form of psychological manipulation in which the abuser attempts to foster a feeling of self-doubt or confusion in the victim's mind. Typically, right, they're seeking to gain some power or control over that other person by distorting that person's reality and maybe forcing them to question their own judgment or intuition.
Right. So if you think about a workplace mobbing situation, what if gaslighting was happening by several people? The manager, a couple people on the team, and it's these tiny little things. But then the subject just loses it one day and screams at their boss in front of the rest of the company and gets fired because they acted inappropriately. So in terms of things to do is sometimes it is warranted to get counseling, right? As I said, the people I've talked to have described it as trauma. And anytime there's trauma, we're usually not the best people to self-diagnose and self-treat. So get counseling, professional psychological counseling, because those tapes can get rewound. And then understand what you have control over and what you don't. If you're halfway down the path and you've allowed this to happen, and you may not have the same tools available as if you are at the beginning of the situation and you have different tools. You can say things earlier. You can document. This has been going on for a couple of years. It's really hard to go back and document what's happened. Sometimes changing jobs is the right thing to do, but then be mindful of how you talk about your previous experience, which relationships come forward with you. If some relationships need to be closed before you can move on, there's all sorts of tools like that. But the answer isn't always to change jobs or to quit or to, things like that. Sometimes there are ways of staying at the company and bringing it to leadership's attention. And you might even realize it's been happening to a lot of other people as well.
Some great tips. Thanks for sharing.
Perfect.
As we reach the end of the episode, getting back to really what's going to build your reputation, we started by asking, what you tell yourself is so important to build that narrative that you can build your reputation around. The other two pieces, what you tell other people. So maybe we can speak just a little bit to that. And then the third piece is what other people share about you, which really speaks more to your reputation. But when we want to build a certain brand, what are some tips that you can tell our listeners of how so if you want to build a brand where you're a powerful leader or you're a respected leader that holds people accountable, that you have these values that you cherish, right? What are some of the things that you can tell other people that really reinforce that brand? Because it all starts with your values and beliefs and what you want to or intend to portray, right?
Well, values are where credibility starts and where trust starts. And we don't work with people we don't trust. And people leave companies because they don't trust their leaders. So trust is everything. What's interesting is what you tell other people. We send mixed messages, right? I tell you I'm passionate about serving the military. But if you go online and see that I fund anti-military groups or I talk negatively about a certain branch of service, all of a sudden the narrative is falling apart. Right. And my ability to build a brand around that falls apart. So consistency really is the key here. What you consistently tell other people. It can even go down as granular as some of the words that you were using to describe leadership. Do you say, I am a thoughtful, empowering leader? Am I a servant leader? Am I a motivating leader? Am I an innovative leader, right? What are the descriptors you're using? One of the things I realized about 5 years into doing this work is that other people are kind of lazy when it comes to choosing the words they'll use to describe you. If you give them the right words that you want, they'll just use them until they see otherwise. So if you say, I'm a very black and white person, I see things very black and white, it's remarkable how people will pick up on the terms black and white and use that to describe you, whether you mean to or not. So consistent, clear messaging through what you post, what you say when you introduce yourself, your elevator pitch, how you want to be talked about. And then in that pass along value, if what you're saying to other people gets shared with other people, when it gets back to you, are they saying the right things? When I do surveys or I get feedback and people say, oh, we know you as the gratitude and generosity lady, it's like, yes, because those are two words I really want to be known by. If somebody describes me as a marketing guru, red flags go off because I'm not I'm personal branding and reputation management. And I use those terms consistently to make sure that the people who hear me don't mischaracterize what I do or how I want to be known, because they'll take what I say. And it's not even so much just what I say, it's what I do. And, doing is more important sometimes than the saying, but they actually work together. So make sure if you want to be that servant leader, that you act like a servant leader. You don't just tell people you're a servant leader. If you want to get into a leadership position to affect change in a positive direction for your organization, make sure they see behavior that's consistent with that, not that you just keep saying it.
That's so true, to be not only consistent with what you say with that narrative, but with your actions as well. Because I'd love to be known as a servant leader that, generous, that shows gratitude. But it's not only saying that, and people, like you said, initially, if you introduce yourself like that, or if you say, these are the values that are important to me, they're going to take your word until they see otherwise, right?
Yeah.
Which is good and bad in some cases, but I think that's a better way to approach life, is give people the benefit of the doubt until they prove you otherwise, than to go back and to go the other way, right? Where you're just jaded and questioning people and waiting for people to prove you right or prove their image wrong. So I think that's great advice. Love it. Final thing is just talking about advice that you could give people as they're building their brand. Maybe these are individuals mid-career switching into a new industry. Maybe they're starting out. What's a few pieces of advice that right away they can implement tomorrow as they're trying to build their brand? We gave them a lot of it. So maybe distill it down to two things that you think they could take away from this episode that they could do right away.
Everything you do and are makes you a brand. So every way you speak about yourself and others, every way you act around other people and online, every relationship that you announce reflects who you are and what you stand for. So don't become paranoid, but become mindful and thoughtful about it. If you're about to hit send on an email, ask yourself, is this on brand for me? Am I representing myself the way that I want to be perceived? Before you post on social media, before you stand up and offer your opinion in a meeting, ask yourself this. Start getting in the habit of asking yourself, is this on brand for me? If somebody were to look at this action or this communication or this relationship and judge me by it, which we know they're going to, would they come to the right conclusion about who I am and what I stand for? As long as that's all intact, go forward and do so with confidence.
I love that question. I think everyone should be asking themselves that every single day. Is this on brand for me? Hopefully you have a deliberate strategy that you're building your brand around so that you have those values that are in place, because first you have to establish the brand, but then asking that question every day, making it sure it's consistent, supported by action, is so critical. And Lida, let us know, let our listeners know how they can get in contact with you.
Well, all roads lead to either LinkedIn for me or my website, which is lida360.com. It is going undergoing a facelift, so it'll be relaunched this summer, but lida360.com. And I'm really active on LinkedIn. I would love to connect with listeners there as well.
Thank you for joining me today, Lida. Thank
you so much. Always a pleasure.
And this concludes this episode of the IMS Leadership Conversations podcast. You can send us your feedback at info@ims-online.com. If you'd like to subscribe, this podcast can be found both on Apple and Spotify, and can also be accessed on the Institute for Management Studies website at ims-online.com. And remember, until next time, it's not what you know that makes a difference, but what you do consistently.